When I think of Mr. Goldberg, I think of the lightness and the ease of his demeanor and how that translated into his classroom. He made you feel safe and he made you want to learn.
When I think about Mr. Goldberg, I think about Newton's universal law of gravitation and the adventures of a New York City cab driver.
When I think about Mr. Goldberg or Jay, I think about family.
The grit to be a New York cabbie, but the heart to come tutor my brother at home when he had a broken hip and couldn't make it to school.
I think of all his entertaining and fun stories that kept us engaged in class.
That infectious smile and putting chocolate chips in the peanut butter jar when it's at the end.
I think about physics. Always thinking about physics.
Quarks, leptons, spin.
Warmth, humor, peace, and love.
AP Physics, chalkboards.
Compassionate, enthusiastic.
Fun science, a teacher who you could really relate to, who felt like a friend as well as a teacher.
I think of trying to learn left hand and right hand rule.
These two hands.
Compassionate, enthusiastic, caring, curious, and legendary.
Contagious enthusiasm. I think of generosity, his time, his spirit, his passion. He made physics live. He made it interesting and worthwhile.
The teacher that inspired us to do great things in life.
A teacher whose enthusiasm and talent inspired and encouraged students to really want to learn a challenging subject.
I think of him getting so excited to teach me a lesson again because I didn't understand and stopping the entire class.
Someone who is able to get a bunch of spastic, crazy kids to learn really hard concepts.
The amount of patience this guy must have had putting up with our shenanigans on a daily basis. It's unbelievable.
Pure joy and laughter. The fact that he cried every time he talked about our class.
I think about the most intense year of my life when I was an exchange student at Annalee High School. And I actually also think about the only year in which I loved physics.
I think about the place where science meets spirituality. I remember loving asking why, over and over in AP Physics. We were just nerding out on science, and eventually Mr. Goldberg would shrug his shoulders and say, quantum physics. And we knew that was the end. We couldn't ask any more whys. And to me, that's where the real mystery began.
I think of his awesome afternoon classes that inspired me to pursue a career in physics.
I think about the guy who inspired me to study physics in undergrad.
The huge advantage he gave me in college physics.
Somebody who inspired me not just to become a scientist, but also to become a teacher.
I would not have embraced it as much as I did without him.
It's 1 a.m. I'm thinking about physics. It's physics.
Pretty much my own personal Carl Sagan.
Someone who I think was pretty core in a theme that evolved in my life of learning that you can be a maker, that you can make things and really have a craft as a core part of what you're doing. And doing all these, fun science experiments in his class and embracing that nerdiness, I think really seeded that message in a way that I don't think many people get elsewhere. And that's pretty awesome.
I think of someone who really loved his job. He was never counting down until the weekends or until summer. Even after 37 years, he just never seemed to get burnt out. And I wanted to find that passion, so I became a teacher too, just like him.
Even those of his students who didn't go on to become physicists benefited and were influenced by his genuine kindness and good spirit.
I think of him walking across the grass with a really pointedly irregular step, and I couldn't resist asking him why, and he said, "I'm avoiding the law of sympathetic resonance and outsmarting my coffee from spilling out of my cup." I'll never forget that.
When we were learning about optics, the projection of the solar eclipse, of the shape of the solar eclipse on the ground that he saw as he was walking through campus.
The Afikoman, because he generously invited me into his house when I was like 17 and I found it for the first time. And he never even commented about how I was like way too old to do it.
Whenever I see that somebody has a new haircut, I'm compelled to tell them that I like it, because that's what Mr. Goldberg always did.
When I think of Mr. Goldberg, I think of the wonder that he brought to his subject. I think of listening to Al Green during tutorial, And I also think of baseball, a shared passion between the two of us in a sport that it can be beautifully described by the laws of physics.
When we'd be talking about mass and energy and speed, a lot of times he would use launching a rocket ship as an example. And when we would talk about launching the rocket, he would say, and then when you push the button, and he would push the button.
That amazing perfect circle he used to draw on the chalkboard.
When I think of Mr. Goldberg, I think of that little smile, giggle, nose twitch thing he used to do. I can't do it, but you always seem so tickled by science, and your enthusiasm was contagious. I hope my girls have a science teacher like you one day.
The time that I think of him actually is when my class is totally out of control, and I'm like, what in the world did Jay do to like get anyone to do anything? And then I try and take a somewhat serious and somewhat humorous approach to getting everyone like back on track, because I think that that's what Jay did.
It never got better than senior year AP Physics with Mr. Goldberg. It just didn't.
I think any person who had his class, who had even had an opportunity to see him in the hallways, was lucky. He was the best teacher, most fantastic. Thank you, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Goldberg. Thank you, Mr. Goldberg.
Thank you, Mr. Goldberg, for being the kind of person that fosters a love of learning.
Thank you, Mr. Goldberg.
Thank you, Mr. Goldberg.
Congrats, Mr. Goldberg.
Thank you, Mr. Goldberg.
Thank you, Mr. Goldberg, for all the years of hard work.
Thank you, Mr. Goldberg.
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 Thanks, Mr. Goldberg.
Thank you, Mr. Goldberg.
Thank you, Mr. Goldberg. Thanks, Mr. Goldberg.
Thank you, 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 Mr. Goldberg.
Thank you for everything. And I feel honored to have been your student and honored to be your friend.
Congratulations, Mr. Goldberg, on your retirement. I hope you enjoy many decades of just being immersed in all things good.
Sugar, baby.